When are those parts of the alternative media that supported Trump's election and urged people to vote for him? I mean, when are they actually going to A, come back into the world of reality, and B, just apologize to the people they misled? And I say misled because it was blatantly obvious what Trump was going to be. And here's a man who, in his election campaign, said we've got to get America out of this process of interfering in the elections of other countries, when that's exactly what the plan was, to continue that. And what Trump was doing, of course, was telling a great chunk of the American population that he had to persuade to vote for him. He was just telling them what they wanted to hear. That we're not going to start intervening in countries and spend all this money on the military abroad, etc. And that's exactly what the plan was. But if he'd have told people that, great chunks of his electorate wouldn't have voted for him. They'd have said, "Oh, this is just business as usual." So he had to promote himself as different. That's what they all have to do. This was Obama's change. I'm about change. Did I say I was about change? I'm about change. Do you know I'm about change? And of course, he was business as usual. Talking of that, Libya. Libya was a Barack Obama, and in this country, Britain, a David Cameron, then Prime Minister, production, but it wasn't really. They fronted it up. It was a neocon production. The neocons that named the list of countries in September 2000, they wanted to regime change. Libya was on the list, Iraq was on the list, and Iran was on the list, and North Korea was on the list, and China was on the list. So this is what's just unfolding. And Libya, for all the faults of Colonel Gaddafi, was the highest per capita income country in Africa. And compared with now, Libya was a paradise. Mind you, anywhere compared with Libya now would be a paradise. And they sent the boys in through NATO, Obama and Cameron, and they devastated the place. Had Gaddafi murdered, and then walked away because they knew what would happen, because Gaddafi had been holding at bay warring factions of monumental morons that run these ethnic and various other factions in Libya. And once he'd gone, well, they started fighting each other again, to the detriment of the vast majority of the Libyan people. I spoke in Canada, what was it, about 2-3 years ago, and someone had actually come from Libya to Canada to attend the event and to meet a friend in Canada. And he was telling me how, just going to the shops is dangerous now because of what's happened to Libya as a result of these psychopaths and what they're doing. And when I say psychopaths, I'm including Barack Obama, the hero of the so-called progressive left, who is just another frontman like Trump of the same force. Anyway, this is the story. Nearly 400 killed, 50,000 displaced in Libya conflict, according to the UN. The World Health Organization says that nearly 400 have been killed and a lot more injured since Libya's renegade general Khalifa Haftar launched a major military offensive to seize the Libyan capital of Tripoli last month. And when it says 400, that's just in this assault. It's not how many have died as a result of the actions of the West. That is through the bloody roof by now. The Geneva-based organization, which is the specialized United Nations Agency on International Public Health, announced that at least 392 people have been killed and 1,936 wounded since forces allied with the so-called Libyan National Army, led by strongman, moron, Haftar, launched an offensive against the internationally recognized Government of National Accord in Tripoli on April the 4th. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Human Affairs also expressed concern about the alarming levels of displacement near the Libyan capital, saying more than 50,000 people are displaced as a direct result of the intensifying armed conflict in Tripoli. Additionally, Othman Abdel Jalil, the GNA's education minister and the head of the government's crisis committee, said that the conflict had displaced 55,000 people, some 11,000 families, and he added that 40 reception centres and 27 schools had opened their doors to render aid to those in need. Earlier this week, the UN warned against the continuing deterioration of the humanitarian situation in the North African country as fierce fighting rages between rival forces for control of the capital. These are the rival forces that were manipulated with not much effort to get rid of Gaddafi. We'll come together and get rid of Gaddafi and then we'll fight each other. Oh, that sounds like a plan. God, if they had a brain cell, they wouldn't know what to do with it. Now, this American warning the world, do what we say or else. This week, through people like Pompeo and Bolton, it's been going through the bloody roof. Every direction. Do this or else, do this or else. All over the world. Here's another. Hands off the Arctic. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo warns China and Russia away from the North. Who is this bloke, Pompeo? He was just appointed by the puppet Trump on the say-so of people that control Trump. And when Pompeo's gone, it will be another front man saying the same as Pompeo. Just a suit with a head on it. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has warned China and Russia to respect our interests in the Arctic or face the consequences. There, in one sentence, has basically been the theme of the week. Frozen and desolate, the Arctic region looks set to be the next frontier for competition between US, Russia and China. Speaking at a meeting of the Arctic Council in Finland on Monday, Pompeo launched a broadside against US competitors in the region, particularly China. Arctic seaways could become the 21st century Suez and Panama Canals, America's top diplomat stated, asking his masters if he got the wording right. China is already developing, he said, shipping lanes in the Arctic Ocean. This is part of a very familiar pattern. Beijing attempts to develop critical infrastructure using Chinese money, Chinese companies and Chinese workers, in some cases to establish a permanent Chinese security presence. And America's not doing the same at all. No. Oh, no. But China's bad. America's good. We believe in freedom and democracy and choice and free speech. Although China holds observer status at the Arctic Council, the country is 900 miles from the Arctic Ocean. Nevertheless, melting polar ice, drop in climate change, means visible sea routes across the region will soon be open, according to climate models. And Beijing has given these consideration in its maritime Silk Road infrastructure plan. During a meeting with China's president last month, Russian President Vladimir Putin expressed interest in linking Russia's North Sea route with China's marine Silk Road. Such a route could slash shipping times, or even slipping times if it's wet, from China to the west by several weeks. Do we want crucial Arctic infrastructure to end up like Chinese constructed roads in Ethiopia, crumbling and dangerous after only a few years? Do we want the Arctic Ocean to transform into a new South China Sea fraught with militarization and competing territorial claims? Said Pompeo. I mean, do we want the world to be fraught with militarization and competing territorial claims? That's our job, said Pompeo. It's a real common theme this week, this warning everyone. And something else that's kind of happened. Because there is a list for regime change, and they're not giving up on it. What's happened in Syria is the Russian intervention has pushed them back, obviously, and in the short term, or in the present, scuppered their plans to remove Assad. But they're not giving up on it because it's being driven by forces out of Israel. And Israel has a massive long-term agenda for Syria, so they're not going to give up on it. And this week we've started seeing attacks on the Russian military in Syria by, quote, rebels. And the rebels in Syria, of course, are controlled, armed, and funded by the West, particularly the United States, under orders from Israel. Headline, Russian military repels 12 rockets fired in new attack on the, pronounce that, Khmeimim air base in Syria. How it's pronounced is irrelevant to the fact that it's happening. So this Russian air base in Syria was targeted by over a dozen missiles on Wednesday, but they were shot down by air defences, the Defence Ministry says. The attack comes less than 2 days after massive shelling by militants, brackets, the United States proxy army, in Syria. The attack was launched from the Idlib de-escalation zone, which is largely controlled by Syrian al-Qaeda offshoot, the Hayat Tahrir al-Sham terrorist group, formerly known as the al-Nusra Front. I don't know how they keep up with these name changes. I'm bored with this name. We've had it 24 hours. What should we call ourselves now? Al-Nusra Front? I'm fed up with it. How about Hayat Tahrir al-Sham? Yeah, al-Sham. What a wonderfully appropriate name, because that's what it all is. A sham, a scam. Fighting from 2 minor militant groups fired 12 rockets in the direction of the airbase, and they say they repelled them. But this is a thing that we'll probably see more of as the next stage of trying to bring about that coup in Syria continues. China, US raises tariffs on $200 billion worth of Chinese imports from 10% to 25%. And, you know, if you want to antagonize a country with a big military because you want to fight, then attack their economy with these sanctions. This is the idea. It's the sanction equivalent of poking someone in the chest and saying, yeah, what are you going to do about it? Because they want a war with Russia and China. They're doing everything they can to bring about the circumstances in which that will break out. People are starting to talk about this now. It was in my books in the 1990s. Washington has carried out the US president's latest threat, increasing import duties of $200 billion worth of Chinese imports from 10% to 25%, according to the Federal Register. The Federal Register is where the presidential executive orders are noted, and this is the process where the president just signs a piece of paper without any debate and it becomes law. And as someone said in the Clinton administration, it's great. Swish of the pen, law of the land, which basically sums up an executive order. Earlier Wednesday, US President Donald Trump, brackets puppet like all of them, said he would be happy to keep tariffs in place on Chinese imports. Am I happy to keep sanctions in place on Chinese imports, sir? I am. I'm happy to keep sanctions tariffs on Chinese imports. This is how the government really works. And because you have a bombastic, oh, I'm big I am kind of president, it gives the impression that he's in charge. You must be joking. The president stressed that Beijing is mistaken if it hopes to negotiate trade later with a democratic presidential administration. So this has been a real theme of the week. And today, as I speak, there's a story running. Pompeo threatens UK with Intel sharing cutoff if they buy Huawei 5G, the Chinese company. US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, I mean, he must be exhausted at the end of the week of warning everybody about everything, he's warned again. The UK has that allowing Huawei to bid on 5G contracts could spell the end of the US-UK special relationship and apparently the UK's membership of Five Eyes. Five Eyes is this network of intelligence agencies in Britain, America, Canada, Australia, etc. With respect to 5G, said the brain of America, the United States has an obligation to ensure that the places we will operate, the places where American information is, the places where we have our national security risks, that they operate inside trusted networks. He might also have added, and because we represent the interests of American corporations and Israeli corporations, which is a massive center for high tech, by the way, a global center for high tech, even though it's just a smear of land in the Middle East, because we represent those companies, we are making sure that Chinese companies don't muscle in on our territory. Oh no, it's about security and intelligence. While each country has a sovereign right to make its own decision about how to deal with the challenge, said Pompeo, meaning you don't really, unless you want to get some in reply, of whether to invite Chinese firms like Huawei and ZTE to bid on infrastructure contracts, the UK certainly wouldn't want to make the wrong decision. I love it. Oh, each country has a sovereign right to make its own decision, as long as it's the right one. What's the right one? The one we tell you to make. So here's another week in the Washington regime's war on the world on behalf of its masters.